Hello students, I'm your science teacher Anjali. Today I'll explain you about the chapter 12, that is friction. Students, you will in this chapter you will learn about the friction, factors affecting the friction, the advantage and disadvantage of the friction, and the various methods by which you can increase or reduce the friction, about the types of friction. So let us start the chapter by few examples. Students, you might have seen a driver of a car or a truck slowing down the vehicle at a traffic signal. Even you have seen that your bicycle slows down whenever needed by applying the brake. Student, have you ever thought why a vehicle slows down when brakes are applied? Not only vehicles, but any object moving over the surface of another object slows down when no external force is applied on it, and finally it stops. So in the chapter you will find the reason of this, that is the friction. Student, friction is a kind of force which opposes the motion. For example, when you push a book which is kept on a table, you will observe that it stops after moving for some distance. And when you repeat this activity from the opposite direction, then also your book stop after some time or after some moving some distance. It is just because of the force which is acting on the book and opposing its motion. So we can define as force of friction which opposes the movement, that is called as a force of friction. Now I'll explain you about the factors which affecting the friction. Factors which affect the friction, that is the nature of the surface. Nature of the surface is the major factor which affects the friction. When we attempt to move any surface, we have to apply force to overcome the interlocking of the surface. Student, friction is caused by the irregularities on the two surfaces in contact. The irregularities on the two surfaces lock into one another, and due to this interlocking of the two surfaces, friction arises. So on the rough surface there are large number of irregularities, and the friction will be greater at the rough surface area. Let us prove by giving the one example. Take two bricks, one is wrapped in a jute and while other is wrapped in polythene. Student, tell me which will be easier to drag and why? Yes, it is easier to drag the brick which is wrapped in the polythene. As polythene has a smooth surface, it has less friction than the jute. Thus, it requires lesser force to drag it, and jute has a rough surface, so it needs more force to drag it. Next, friction is caused by the irregularities and even because of the rough surface. Children, there are three kinds of friction: static friction, sliding friction, and the rolling friction. I'll explain you one by one. First is the static friction. Static friction is a kind of friction in which is produced between the two surfaces in contact with each other at the position of the rest, which is called as a static friction. This type of friction is more powerful than others. It is not easy to overcome the static friction, and this friction needs lot of energy to overcome. Second, that is the sliding friction. The friction which arises when two objects in contact are in motion. That is called as a sliding friction. It is lesser than the static friction but more than the rolling friction. In this type of friction, irregularities of surface do not get enough time lock with each other as the objects are already in the motion. Third is the rolling friction. The friction arises when two bodies are rolling on each other is called as a rolling friction. Rolling movement of both the objects do not allow the locking of irregularities, so it is the smallest friction out of three types of friction. Now there is one another type of friction, that is a fluid friction. Fluid friction is a kind of friction which occur in the fluid, and to the gases and the liquids we called as a fluid. This friction exerted by the fluid on an object, that is called as a fluid friction. Fluid friction is also called as a drag. The factors on which the fluid friction depends on are: number 1, fluid friction depends on its speed with respect to the fluid. That is, it depends upon the speed in which the object moving. Second, fluid friction of an object also depend on the shape of the object. That is, the object must have a streamlined shape. Friction force due to the fluid also depends on the nature of the fluid. It is all explained by giving an example. You know that the object are given a special shape to minimize the friction. That is why the aeroplanes is also look like a bird. This shape minimize the friction and thus it enables the aeroplane, even the birds, both fly in the air and have to face friction exerted by the air. There are so they are so shaped that they do not have to lose energy. While overcoming the frictional force exerted by the air to fly. Therefore, children, aeroplane is also shaped streamlined so that they can overcome the friction force of the air. Now, the next topic is the advantage of friction and the disadvantage of friction. First of all, I'll explain you about the advantage of friction. Children, without friction, we are not able to do so many things. Like we are not able to write with a pen or a pencil. We are not able to write on the blackboard with the chalk. If the objects start moving, it would never stop because there is no friction. We cannot walk on the road without friction. Even we cannot fix a nail on the wall or a tie a knot without friction. So these are the advantage of the friction. On the other hand, you are having the disadvantage about the friction. It wears out material. It wears out material whether they are screws, ball bearings, soles of shoes. Even it also causes the damage to the part of the machine because as I told earlier, the friction always take place when the two objects roll over each other, or you can say they come in contact with each other. Friction also produces heat, like when a machine is operated, heat is generated and this causes wastage of energy. Tires of the cars, bus, trucks, etc. are also worn out due to the friction. And friction reduces the speed due to which more force is required. So in this way we see that friction is harmful as well as useful. So we can say that it is a necessary evil. And last, I'll explain you about how can you increase or reduce the friction. Children, there are so many methods by which you can increase the friction. Like you can increase the friction by using the brake pads in the brake system of bicycle and automobiles. When you're riding a bicycle, the brake pads do not touch the wheels, but when you press the brake lever, their pads arrest the motion of the rim due to the friction. The wheels stop moving. Second example, kabaddi players rub their hands in the soil for better grip of their opponents. Even you have seen the gymnasts also apply some coarse substance on their hands to increase the friction for the better grip. In some situation, friction is undesirable and we would want to minimize it. So there are very many methods by which you can reduce the friction. For example, You sprinkle the powder on the carom board to reduce the friction. Even a bicycle or motor machine uses grease between the moving parts of their machine so that you can reduce the friction and in order to increase the efficiency. So in above example, oil, grease, graphite are all applied between the moving parts of a machine. Uh, by this, a thin layer is formed there and moving surface do not directly rub against each other, and thus the interlocking is avoided to a great extent and makes the movement smooth. So all these substances which reduce the friction are called lubricants. But in some machines we are not advisable to use oil as a lubricant. There an air cushion between the moving part is used to reduce the friction. So all so that's all in your chapter friction. I hope everyone has understand this chapter. Thank you.